Hello, welcome to our cottage at Nashville. I'm Matthew Atherton Baber, and for those of you who have just found me recently, I'm mainly a teacher of rather fine floristry. But no matter what we do it, none of us, in a vacuum. We have to live, we have to eat, we have to sleep somewhere, and we need connections with the people around us. And to quote William Morris, the true secret of happiness lies in taking a genuine interest in all the details of daily life. I could not say it better myself. I also think of my dear friend, the beloved French cook, Marina Fiore, who always says, never underestimate the power of a few good drinks and a really great meal. So in that vein, yes, I'm a teacher of floristry, and yes, I write about gardening and cooking and other things. Today we are baking biscuits. Boy, biscuits are a subject of high controversy and hot views, no pun intended. And if you are from the American South, especially, you and your family probably have views on biscuits. The tradition in my family, first of all, there were no great biscuit makers, so I was never terribly fond of biscuits. I thought, what is this rage for biscuits? And our tradition was biscuits were only for breakfast and maybe for snacks. And yeast rolls were served at lunch or dinner or fancy parties. But I met my husband, who was from a biscuit-making family, and he greatly turned me on to them. I think he sort of took my resistance to biscuits as a challenge, and I will say he won me over. Bowled me over even. So the recipe I'm going to give you today is his recipe for biscuits. And I will give it with the, first of all, thanks to him, but the disclaimer that he calls this fatty biscuits. He thinks these are rather rich. To me, I say a lean biscuit is a horrid, unforgivable heresy, but he has also persuaded me that leaner biscuits can be delicious. So if you want to reduce the amount of fat by about a third, you certainly could. It is different, but it's an experience worth having, and there are purposes for it. So, also, if you've seen my peach film and want to know how I made the biscuits for the top crust, you're about to know. And for all the details, of course, go to my blog, mathertonbaber.com. From the main menu, select blog, and I'll put all these details there. So, biscuits. There are a lot of, as I said, views and opinions about them. There are many, many different styles and techniques for making them. I would say everyone that makes biscuits does it slightly in their own way, and rightly so. And there are different styles of biscuits. There are drop biscuits. There are flaky layered biscuits that are almost like pastry, and that's the kind we're going to do today. There's a fast food style of biscuit. Anyway, a biscuit for everyone. I think this one's great. Who doesn't love to see those beautiful flaky layers rising up, and then you can break them open and spread them with butter or jam or whatever you love. So, how do we get going? The important thing is not only the ingredients, but the technique of how we combine them. So I do encourage you to pay attention to that. We could take these same ingredients and the same proportion, combine them with a different technique and get an entirely different result. So how we do it matters. In this bowl, I have flour, and the flour is white lily. I cannot say the availability of white lily flour all around the world, but what you want is a unusually soft flour made of winter wheat. That is not to say cake flour. If you use cake flour, you will not have the same result. But look for an all-purpose flour made of soft winter wheat, and the brand used absolutely universally in the South is white lily, if you can get your hands on it. And if you can find it elsewhere, I suggest you use it too. This is all-purpose white lily, not self-rising, because to it I've already added a little bit of salt, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of baking powder, a little bit of baking soda. That's already here, and I have mixed it well. In fact, if you have any doubt about your flour, your other ingredients, how they might have settled in their packaging, sift them together as you measure them. Now, what comes next is important. You could make an all-shortening biscuit. Certainly when I was growing up, the brand was Crisco. You could also use lard, and that's what we're going to do today. half lard and half butter. Could you make an all butter biscuit? Absolutely. Is it wonderful? Yes. I grew up hearing the old timers, my grandfather, his generation and older, saying, oh, things were so much better when they're made with lard. So when I got my hands on some lard, I started trying it out, and I quite agree. But I would not put the lard in the same way I do the butter. And let me show you why. This is lard that I've bought at the grocery store. It is clean and pure. It is not just pork fat. Lard is prepared. I'm going to put it in. And some people would use a pastry blender, and some people would sort of mash with their fingers, and that is not what we want. I'm going to toss all the cubes of lard to coat, and then I'm going to run them through my fingers to make small flakes, like little flakes of fish food, or I don't know, whatever else that you have that's flaked. But you'll see, I'm tossing them. If we were in a fancy classroom, we'd have one of those mirrors overhead that tilts so you can see everything in the bowl. But this will be just as good. So I'm pressing them, as you see. Pressing them in my fingers, first to make sort of just large pressed curls. And you see I'm pressing them basically between my thumbs and index fingers with a little bit of support from the third finger. And as I get them more and more squeezed into these little flakes, I might use a few more fingers to help it along and squeeze it a bit more through my closed hands, but it is always with this rolling action to make flakes. Makes all the difference. How finely am I going to flake it in? I want the lard to be quite small. Let's call it like panko breadcrumbs, something like that. And quite homogeneous. Then we're going to put the butter in, and we're going to use the same pinching technique to leave it in larger pieces. And that, when it's in the oven, the water in the butter will create steam, and that's what will make them rise. So, before you have started, remember to preheat your oven. That's another thing that has a lot of lore in biscuit making circles. Some people say you should use a rising oven, meaning let's say you set your temperature to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, but you put your biscuits in when the oven reaches about 400. Personally, I want to know that my biscuits are going directly into a very hot oven, not a rising oven. So, I don't say the riser school is wrong, it's just not what I do. I heat my oven hotter than I want it, call it 500 degrees. And when I open the door to put my biscuits in, I'm going to lose some heat, inevitably. So, you want to position your oven rack in about the middle of the oven. If you go too low to the bottom, you could burn the bottom of your biscuits and the top not be brown. If you go too far in the upper half of the oven, it could be just the opposite. The top is burned and the bottoms are completely unbrowned. So the middle of the oven for the rack, I like to make my oven very hot. And as soon as I've put the biscuits in and closed the door, I do not walk away. I stand there and I count to, I don't know, 20, to give the oven a moment to recover, and then I set the timer. So, in the time it's taken me to tell you that, look what I have achieved. This is like panko, breadcrumbs, and finer. So that's wonderful. Now, I have made a bit of a mess here, but that's okay. I want to show you now how to handle the butter. I have here the amount of butter I want. This is a good quality of butter, but not the most extravagant table butter. And it is cold. Now, brace yourself. I don't want to scare anyone, but cold, I am going to give it a few hits with my rolling pin so that I soften it up and make it rather plastic in a thinner layer. Then I'll show you why that's important for how I incorporate it. Ah, very good. Now, it's good to pull the paper off and rotate it so you don't damage the paper too much and then have to pick paper out of your butter. I want a pretty thin layer, maybe 1/4 of an inch or even a bit less. Easy enough. Now, this is just brown parchment paper that I've used here. So, I have these wonderful sort of flat plaques of butter. And I put this into the mix. I just drop them in, and I toss them to coat them in the mixture. And then, with hands full of flour, I pinch these. And I don't pinch them with any preciousness. You know, I want something about like that. That's maybe like 2 or 3 garden peas. Maybe some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller. But as you go, spread them around so that you are putting this into the flour mixture. And because we have put this in this thin layer, creating our flakes is already off to an extremely good start. And while you're doing it, you can think about your life or think about how you're going to serve your biscuits. I will tell you, as I pinch this in and then use the same technique to flake the butter into the mixture further, that these biscuits, and I'll show you how to do it at the end of the film, are very, very good to make ahead and bake when you need them. In fact, I had a wonderful friend. She was maybe the most glamorous person I'll ever know. And she was Italian, and she was regal, and she was the reigning queen of Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue society in New York for decades. And then she went to Palm Beach, and she was the reigning queen of Palm Beach society for many decades. And I knew her late in life when all of that was behind her, and she just wanted to eat wonderful food and enjoy her life. And in fact, I was developing some financing to premiere an opera that I composed, and someone said to me at dinner at the Four Seasons Hotel, where we're eating our beautiful lobster salads, "Do you know so-and-so?" Her. I said, "Absolutely not. I have no idea who this person is." And she said, "Oh, well, she's a wonderful cook, and you two will love each other. And you're going to go to her house for dinner, and you'll be the best of friends." And it turns out that's exactly how it went. And we were friends the whole rest of her life. And every time I went to see her, the first thing she wanted me to do is start some of these biscuits so the next morning we could eat them together. So if that's not an endorsement, I don't know what is. Now, this is probably a case of do not do what I'm doing. I'm using this sharp knife to remove some of this pastry biscuit dough from my hands. And I cannot suggest you do that because it is dangerous. I don't want you to hurt yourself, nor do I want you bleeding into your biscuits. But biscuits are basically as simple as this. We're just now going to bring this mix together with some buttermilk. Let me put this old paper aside. Bring it together with some buttermilk. Now, in some places you can't get buttermilk, so what could you use instead? You can always take whole milk, and for every cup, add a good hefty tablespoon of acid. That could be white vinegar, cider vinegar, lemon juice, so on. I would not use an acid with a really strong commitment of flavor like lime juice or some kind of flavored vinegar, but kind of a neutral acid. And you have to be careful how much of the buttermilk you add, because you certainly can't take it out. And the kind of flour you've used, the temperature of your kitchen, the humidity of the day, all these factors impact how much of the buttermilk your flour and your biscuit mixture can absorb. So, I'm going to start by adding, maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of what the recipe asks for, and see where it gets me. And if parts of the batter, as I see here, I really shouldn't call it a batter, it's more of a dough. As parts of the dough come together and parts of the dough are dry, don't try to force the dry patch into the cohesive bit. Just add a little bit more of your milk or buttermilk to the dry patch, and then you will have two accumulations of dough that will marry together happily. Now, I have this dough in pieces with a little bit of dry crumb in the bottom, and that is exactly where we want to go onto the board. I'm going to move this out of our way. A little bit of bench flour. Not a whole lot. You don't want to add a large volume of flour to what you're doing. But I'm going to put it here, and I want you to see, I'm hiding nothing from you, that this looks like a mess. Most people would say, oh dear me, those are not biscuits. Well, not yet, they're not. But take a bench scraper. If you don't have a heavy metal one, you could use a heavy plastic one. And you want to press this out and just begin folding it together as if you were maybe folding over a book or folding a letter. See how that already has begun bringing it together? Clean off my scraper as I work. I'm not doing any fancy method by turning it around. I'm simply doing it so that it is in a position where I can get a good leverage to turn. Now, if you've ever made a puff pastry, you know about making turns and laminating your dough. And we're not going to be as literal as puff pastry about this, but when you make a couple of turns like this, you are, I'm pressing it down so I can continue working just a little bit, you are creating the same idea. Now, just a tiny bit of flour. We filmed these here in the cottage dining room, so I'm making a nice mess that I will clean up when we're done. And I think I'll give it one more turn. What you do not want to do is manhandle your dough. If you were to use a higher protein flour, you would have a smaller margin of error for your biscuits becoming tough. And I certainly don't want you to deal with that as a terrible problem, though tough biscuits are a frequent complaint. So, before I roll this out, I'm not cleaning this board per se. To give it a little more flour, just a little more on top, and rather than roll, I'm going to just slightly press them out. And you see it is a damp dough. If you need a little flour, just add it in the spot. It's perfectly fine. How thick or thin do you leave these? Depends on what you want to do. Personally, I leave them a little thicker because I think people like the look of an impressively risen biscuit, and a thin little wimpy biscuit has never seemed appetizing to anyone I know. But if that's what you like in life, far be it from me to tell you you're wrong. So, I should use my scraper to even this up a little bit. This is about the right size, and I want to make sure I've not stuck. Good, I haven't. Now, you don't have to have a perfectly smooth top. If your guests complain that your biscuit top wasn't completely smooth, I encourage you to reevaluate who you're having for dinner. There, these are a little on the thick side, but that does not bother me. Now, with my sharp knife, I'm going to run it through a little bit of flour, and I'm just going to straighten this up a little bit. So we have nice, straight sides, relatively straight sides. No need to be ridiculous about it. But we do want people to know that a serious effort was made. Okay, now, how many biscuits do we want to cut from this? Well, I'd say that depends on how large you want your biscuits to be. To me, this looks reasonable to cut 3 across and 2 across. So why am I cutting this with a knife and not with a round cutter, you ask? It's just simply what I like. I think the round cutter wastes a lot of dough. If you re-roll your dough, you're losing a lot of these layers you've worked hard to create. So if you cut with a knife, cut straight down. If you cut with a biscuit cutter, also cut straight down. Do not press down and twist, or you may smear together the lamination of your layers and they won't rise properly. So I'm going to put these on my tray, almost touching. Why almost touching? Because as they rise in the oven, they will encourage each other upward and make a more impressive, flaky, light, delicious biscuit. And otherwise they could bulge out to the side a little bit, which is just not as beautiful and produces a less flaky result. Now, the scraps I've trimmed off, this piece is a little thick, so I cut it in half. I always just lay them around the edge, and I do that because that's what my grandmother did with her pie crust, and my sister and I always enjoyed the result. So, some people would roll the scrap together and bake it as what they call the dog biscuit. That's very traditional in the South. But in the meanwhile, this is what we've got. Now, I'm going to cut away, clean my hands, sweep up this flour, and then show you how I either get these into the oven or prepare them ahead to cook when I need them. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Here I am with the biscuits right as we left off, unbaked. Let me reiterate a few points from earlier because they are really essential. The flour you use is pivotal. White Lily all-purpose flour is what I've used here, and it's what I recommend you use too. You might ask, why don't you use self-rising? And that is because I want to control the amount of leavening and salt that's in the flour. I don't like leaving it to chance. Then if you buy self-rising, it's just whatever the manufacturer has given you. And I have to say, the flour is a good reason to remind you also that making biscuits, as I said, is more of a technique than it is a recipe. So I'm going to put on my blog exactly what I've done here, the best recipe I know. But if you make it 3, 4, 5 times, it may take you until the last time in those initial trials to get the hang of it. Don't give up. We learn more from failure than from success. Also, there are so many variables. As I mentioned, the ambient humidity, the temperature of your house, the temperature of your ingredients, the exact flour you're using, that you've got to get the feel of it more than just say, A, B, C, D ingredients in X, Y, Z quantities always give me the same result, because they don't. Every time you make biscuits, they will be a little different, and the really great biscuit makers know the feel and the look of it, and they adjust as they go. If you've seen my videos on strawberries or peaches or hors d'oeuvres using eggs, you know that I always say, engage your cooking very sensitively and adjust as you go. And while you're not adjusting, in this case, the seasonings, you are adjusting your method and a little more flour, a little less buttermilk, and so on. So take heart and take your technique seriously with some flexibility. So here we are. We have the dough, the biscuits cut, and they are on a piece of parchment paper on a baking tray. And I always like these heavy-duty commercial ones, because if you use a really thin one, it may have hot spots, it may burn your biscuits or whatever you're cooking more easily. Just use a good heavy pan. And so now you have a choice. You can take these exactly as they are, put them on a shelf in your freezer. I slide them in just like this, flat, uncovered. And when they are frozen solid, bang them like a rock, then I drop them in heavy-duty zip-top type freezer bags, really heavy ones to keep off the freezer burn. I squeeze out all the air, And then I put them in my deep freeze for a morning when I want a few biscuits, or maybe I've got someone that is unexpectedly staying for dinner and I want something a little special to complete my menu. What do? I bring the frozen biscuits, however many I want, even if I want one, that's fine. Bring it out, put it on the tray, exactly like I have these. No difference. You're going to bake them directly from frozen. The only difference it makes is it adds a few minutes to your cooking time. You do not change the temperature of your oven. So remember, your oven is preheated. I'm going to say preheat it to 450 or 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, adjust that if you work in Celsius. And before you put the biscuit in, you want to wash it with beaten egg. This is whole egg, white and yolk, beaten with just a tiny, tiny bit of water. And the water is really only if you need it. So you don't want to glaze it heavily because you don't want a beautiful biscuit with a layer of scrambled egg on top. You just want a very light brushing, and the egg will brown darker than the surrounding dough that is unwashed. So be careful where you paint. And if you have a very jagged line of where you've brushed on top, that's what will brown. You will see that in the final browning. If you paint it on beautifully evenly, and that's one thing that a good clean edge on the top of your biscuit will give you. See, I don't have to try to paint that straight edge. I just run the brush right there, and the shape I've cut the biscuit does all the work for me. And I do want a substantial glaze, but because I don't want it pooling, as soon as I paint this on to the last one, I'm going to go back to the first one and give it another light brushing. And it all sounds more complicated than it probably is, so do not be put off. Just take it one step at a time. Practice when you are home alone or the stakes are very low, because what you don't want to do is try this for the first time when you're having VIP guests, and then what could be seen as a disappointing result happens at all the worst times. So, in fact, that's a good rule to live by. Never make a new recipe when company's coming. Now, if these were previously frozen, all you have done is put them on this tray and started painting on the egg wash, exactly as I'm doing now. No difference whatsoever. And as soon as it's glazed, they go directly into the oven. So let me remind you what I do about the oven. We've preheated it to 500 degrees, and you don't just want the air temperature in the oven to reach that temperature. You want the whole oven box, the shelving grid, all of that to reach that hot temperature. That helps retain the heat when you open the door. So let's say I don't know your oven, but let's call it a half hour. Give it a good 20-30 minutes to warm up. You put this in on the center rack, close the door, and do not walk away. Set a timer or count to about 30 seconds. Then set your timer. How long are you going to set it for? Just like I don't know your flour and the humidity on the day you're making biscuits, I don't know your oven. Let's say you turn it down to 425 degrees. You want a hot oven so that the butter in the biscuits, the water in the butter will turn to steam, and that's what gives you your rise in combination with the baking soda and baking powder therein. So you do not want a cold oven. Certainly do not bake them under 400 degrees. So let's call it 425. If your oven runs hot, they might take as little as 12 or 13 minutes. If your oven is a little cooler or less consistent and maybe it cycles to maintain the heat, it might even take you 20 or 22 minutes. But what you do is you wait till they're nice and evenly sort of chestnut brown as you like, and then you can carefully take one from the oven and look at the bottom. The bottom should be nicely browned. Because I have put a tiny bit of sugar in this dough, that aids with browning. It encourages browning all over. And if you are unsure, you can take one biscuit, maybe one of the less beautiful ones, and open it. I don't generally advise you to open them hot because a little like meat, they need to come out of the oven and rest briefly before you eat them. But you can open one and see if it's cooked. If it's still doughy, they need a little longer. If it's beautifully cooked, you're done. If the tops are browning faster than the inside is cooking, you can simply lay a piece of aluminum foil over the whole pan of biscuits. So just lay it over the top. I never seal it around the bottom. Maybe if you need to anchor it in the corner so it doesn't blow off with your oven fan, that's fine. But that will shield the top from browning. It will slow the browning while the interior of your biscuits catch up with cooking. So when they are done, take them out of the oven. And if you feel so inclined, you may fork a big chunk of cold butter and rub it meltingly over the tops of them, which is very delicious. But they frankly don't need it. And if you want to make some variations to this, right before they go in the oven, after they're glazed, you could sprinkle them with toasted seeds. You could sprinkle them with sanding sugar if you were going to use them as a shortcake. There are many things you could do. You could sprinkle them with poppy seeds. You get the idea. But this basic biscuit will not let you down. You will see if you go to my blog that I use them with strawberries to make a fabulous strawberry shortcake. And I give you all the suggestions you need to make it very humble at home or even fancy enough for something really regal like a state dinner. You could do the same with other fruit. As I show you in my peaches film, you can use these as the top crust for a cobbler or any kind of juicy, fruity country dessert. And in another film I have coming up, I'm going to show you how I present these at the table in a beautiful bread basket. So do watch for that. In the meanwhile, check my blog for the full recipe, mathertonbaber.com. From the main menu, of course, select blog. And you may find me on Instagram at mathertonbaber, YouTube, mathertonbaber. As you see, please do subscribe to the channel if you like this content. Click the like icon, click the bell to know when I have more films coming. And in the comments, do let me know how your biscuits go and how you like the content and what you want to see more of and so on. And I'm on Facebook, M. Atherton Baber Studio-Workshop, excuse me. So that's the basic story of excellent Southern biscuits. Give it a try, be patient, try and try again. I hope you love them. I'll see you soon.